Hi everyone, I am Vinod. I'm a senior mentor at Skillhouse platform. In the last video, we have seen GitHub Operations at high level. In this video, I'm going to explain you the GitHub Operations in a slightly detailed way so that you can understand it better. So first thing, as I said in the last video, you need to have a github.com account. So first, please go to github.com and then create your own account and log into github.com using that credentials. Once you log in, all you have to do is create your own repository. So repository is a collection of your documents, or it can be your code or anything for that matter. A repository is a storage is what we can call it as. So you can create your own repository in GitHub if you have a valid account. And the repository that you're going to create over here in the github.com is called as remote repository because it exists in the server, and the server is always remote, which is not your local machine. So that's the reason we call this as a remote repository. Once you create your remote repository or repository in github.com, you have to open your local path in your machine and clone your repository in local. So the storage that you have created in the github.com, that you're going to clone it in your local path, which in turn called as local repository. So there is always a connection between your local repository and your remote repository. The local repository is a clone of your or a copy of your remote repository. In order to do the cloning operation, you have two approaches. One, you can go ahead with command prompt, command line commands such as git clone followed by the remote repository path. And when you execute this, you have to ensure that you're in the right folder where the repository has to be cloned. Say for example, if you want to clone the repository in D drive under folder named local path, then you have to open the D drive and go to the folder called local path and then open the command prompt in that path and then execute this command. So what happens is your remote repository will be cloned in D drive under local path folder. So that local path folder is going to be called as local repository. Now onwards, whatever you enter, it may be a project or it may be a small file for that matter, that will be tracked in your local repository, and you can always sync those files or the projects or any source code for that matter to your remote repository. So as I said, there are two options. One is command line. Second is that if you have Visual Studio, you can open the Visual Studio and there are mechanisms to clone your remote repository into local repository by using user interfaces. There is a nice user interface which Visual Studio provides. You don't have to execute any command. So using that UI or user interface, you can always clone. Now it doesn't matter which approach you follow. Ultimately, your local repository will be created. Now, as I mentioned, this local repository is nothing but the local storage, which is a replica of your remote repository. Any file you add to the local repository, in other words, D drive local path in this example, that will be tracked in the local repository. And so for example, in my case, I may go ahead and then create a new project called console application. At the end, it is also a file. So I will commit to the local repository and then that will be available in the local repository. Once you commit the changes, as I said, the commit can be done by git commit command. Once you commit, your job is to sync it with your remote repository. As you can see, the file that you added in the local repository does not yet exist in your remote repository, and this local repository is something that you cannot share it with someone else because it is your local. Unless you sync it up with your remote repository, your teammates will not be able to get your changes in order to do some changes in their machine. So first thing that we need to do is sync our local repository into our remote repository, which can be done by git push operation. Don't worry, don't need to by heart these commands. There are other ways. Visual Studio will provide us a nice UI to do these operations, which I'm going to explain you in the later stage, but try to understand the concept through this video. Once your remote repository is in sync with your local repository, it can be always shared with your friends or your teammates, where they can clone your repository, right? And then to their local repository they can clone it and then start working. When they are done with their changes, they will also do the same thing called git push, which will again update your remote repository. There is a concept of branch which I am going to explain in the next video. Hope this is helpful. Thank you guys.